Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erin Alaman, the Executive Director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. Thank you for joining us today and to start an important discussion about how COVID-19 is impacting our region. The pandemic has really shone light on the strength of our people, from essential workers to first responders to those of us who are staying at home to do our part. However, it's also exposing underlying problems in our region in ways we haven't seen before. CMAP research shows that essential workers from disadvantaged communities, particularly people of color and those who live in low-income communities, are playing critical roles in providing health care and keeping transportation, food supply, and other essential systems functioning during this crisis. This also means that minorities, often essential workers, make up a disproportionate number of COVID-19 deaths in Chicago. The region's long-range plan, Onto 2050, identified economically disconnected areas, or communities left behind and lacking investment, as being directly tied to lower health outcomes. Without intentional investment and reinvestment strategies, these areas will continue to be left behind. As we start preparing for a new normal, this provides us an opportunity to intentionally shape our region's future, rather than let it shape us. However, in order to do so, we need an understanding of how the pandemic is affecting the region. And that's why we're here today, to hear from CMAP staff on how regional systems like municipal revenues, transportation, and climate are being affected by COVID-19, and what our new reality could look like in the coming years. A few housekeeping matters first. This webinar is in listen-only mode, so should you have questions, you can submit them in the chat box. We'll try to answer as many of those questions at the end as time allows. A recording of the webinar will be available on CMAP's website later this week, and we'll share the recording with in our weekly update on Friday. Before I introduce our first panelists, we'd like to know a little bit about who you are. So we've got a quick poll to find out who you might be. I'll give folks on the line just a moment to select their option. Great. It looks like we have a nice mix of folks on the phone today, with about 30% in municipal government and other government represented as well. Some private sector folks, about a quarter of the folks, and some nonprofit folks as well. So thank you for joining us today. Now for our first panelist, Lindsay Hollander, Senior Policy Analyst, with a look at how municipal revenue may be impacted by COVID-19. Following her, Craig Heather will share recent data on dramatic changes on travel since early March, and then followed by Jason Navoda will report on how COVID-19 may affect our regional climate. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Thank you, Erin. The pandemic has had significant impacts across the world, but CMAP is studying several ways that COVID-19 and our response to it is affecting our region here in northeastern Illinois. And our municipalities face increased expenses through providing additional resources and support to residents and businesses, but also significant decreases in their revenues. And as many folks in our audience know, municipal budgets are taking a hit. And today we're going to spend some time thinking about how it might impact municipal tax revenue in northeastern Illinois. And I should start by saying that the impact is really uncertain. We don't know whether the current stay-at-home order is going to be extended. We don't know how unemployment levels are going to change in the long term or the short term, and we also don't know the impact on business closures. In fact, after the pandemic's over, we don't even really know what normal is going to look like. And while our current situation isn't necessarily parallel to this, CMAP did look at the data from the last recession, the one that was in 2007 to 2009, just as a comparison. And we found that during that recession, overall state revenues dropped 16% before they started growing again a couple years later in 2011. And reductions in tax revenue like that will be felt by both state and local governments. And those effects will be felt by municipalities in different ways. And that's because different municipalities really rely on different revenue sources for funding their public services and infrastructure. So today we're going to explore state and local sales tax revenue. Then we're going to look into the revenues that flow into the local government distributive fund, and so that's the state income tax, and also the state use tax, which is it's that tax that you pay on purchases from out-of-state businesses instead of the sales tax. And then we're also going to look at property taxes levied by municipalities. And as you can see on this chart here on your screen, property tax revenue actually represents the largest revenue source for most municipalities in the region. But also sales tax revenue and that local government distributive fund revenue represent the largest source for many others. And actually most municipalities rely on a mix of these revenues plus many others. And some of those other sources will probably be impacted by the pandemic too. Sources like utility tax revenue, gaming taxes for casinos for some municipalities, and also food and beverage taxes that diners pay at restaurants. And also municipalities really do differ in their overall fiscal health and revenue base, and those factors will also drive whether they're able to ensure public services and programs can continue in these times, either by using cash reserves or by shifting their budget priorities. So now we are going to go to a quick poll. So for those folks on the line in local government, which is likely to account for most of your budget gap due to COVID-19? Is that going to be increased expenses due to the response to COVID-19, decreased revenues from any or all sources, or is that budget gap still uncertain? So please go ahead and vote. Oh, okay, so we have a vast majority of respondents here stating that decreased revenues will most likely account for most of the budget gap from COVID-19. So thinking about our revenue context, I think, is particularly important. And we will start by thinking about sales tax revenue. Many municipalities are reliant on sales tax revenues, and more specifically, some municipalities rely heavily on revenues generated from general merchandise sales in particular. So those are sales of products like clothes and toys, and also restaurant sales. And those are things that are currently less available for purchase. If you go to a store, many of those businesses are currently closed for now. And the map you see here on your screen illustrates the estimated municipal reliance on state and local sales tax revenue generated from those general merchandise sales in 2018. And so this excludes sales tax revenue generated from food, grocery sales, drug sales. And those municipalities in dark green are the most reliant on these general merchandise-based sales tax revenues, and then the light green would be the least reliant from 2018. And currently, those municipalities that are more reliant on their general merchandise base are going to be most likely to be affected. And to give you a sense of what tax bases often look like across municipalities, general merchandise sales account for more than 75% of the sales tax base in 3/4 of the region's municipalities. And oftentimes the communities that are particularly reliant on general merchandise sales are ones with large retailers or malls, some of which are closed right now. And oftentimes these communities impose lower municipal property taxes, or in a couple cases, none at all. And on the other hand, due to their existing levels of resources and potential reserves, many of these same municipalities may actually have greater ability to handle some of the effects of the current stay-at-home order and any subsequent economic downturn. So moving on to the local government distributive fund. Municipalities and counties receive a portion of both state income and use tax revenue through that local government distributive fund, and that's shared primarily based on a share of the population of the state. And this map shows these revenues as a percent of total municipal revenues for 2018. And you can see that most of the region is in light aqua, and with these funds being less than 10% of revenues in 2018. But you do have several municipalities relying heavily on these revenues in dark aqua. Oftentimes, these are places with a large residential base, but fewer businesses. And if lower revenues were to accrue to the local government distributive fund, these municipalities would be most affected. So why would that occur? Well, a few different factors may come into play. Individual income tax revenue could actually drop due to greater unemployment as a result of the pandemic. And at this point, it's not totally clear what unemployment's going to look like after this current stay-at-home order is lifted, but an economic downturn would likely continue unemployment trends. Also, business closures and just general lower economic activity would reduce corporate income tax revenue coming into the fund. And then in terms of use tax revenue, so again, that's the tax that consumers pay on purchases from out-of-state businesses. And I would say that the impact of the pandemic on that use tax is unclear. Right now, we may see remote sales driven up while sales within Illinois go down as consumers may be purchasing items online instead of just at a store in person in Illinois. But moving forward into the future, if we continue to have higher unemployment, this would actually reduce purchasing power, and that would then likely reduce remote sales. And now we are going to move on to the property tax. So property tax, and again, this is the largest source for many municipalities in the region. In fact, 134 municipalities rely on the property tax for more than 30% of their revenues. And if you look at this map, it compares reliance on property taxes in purple with the highest reliance in dark purple, and then the lowest reliance in lavender. And it compares that reliance to the region's economically disconnected and disinvested areas overlaid in hatched gray. You can see that on your screen there. And many of these disinvested municipalities are reliant on property tax revenues. So the pandemic and any subsequent economic downturn could result in a couple different challenges to property taxes, and those impacts may be disproportionately felt by communities with disinvested areas. So for one, some property owners may simply not be able to pay their taxes this year, either due to unemployment that they may experience or business closures. So the effects of this will really vary depending on the level of timeliness of payment, but then also eventually whether investors purchase the taxes at the county tax sale. So tax investors often buy these taxes in most areas of the region when that tax sale eventually occurs, and that does result in local governments getting these revenues. But in some disinvested areas of the region, these taxes may go unpurchased. In the short term, what does that mean? It could mean that there's less property tax revenue for local governments, and that would potentially reduce the resources that are immediately available to provide some of the necessary programs and services that our local governments are carrying out to meet some of the community needs due to the pandemic. But also, homeowners and business owners that can't pay their property taxes may eventually have difficulty in keeping their properties. In the long term, though, following that pandemic, the property tax base may decrease if there is an economic downturn. And if the property tax base, so that means the assessed value of properties, if that decreases, that would normally drive up property tax rates. So for communities with disinvested areas, higher property tax rates in particular could cause more difficulty in recovering from any economic downturn. And then that's because higher rates actually might hurt economic development efforts moving forward. And many of these communities actually already have high property tax rates. So that's all to say that the overall context of different municipalities experiencing different challenges based on their revenue structure really underlies the fact that existing regional challenges are being compounded by the pandemic. For example, residents of color, particularly Black and Hispanic workers, often experience lower incomes and higher unemployment. And these same residents may be disproportionately impacted by economic conditions under both the current stay-at-home order restrictions, but also any future economic downturn that may occur. At the same time, some residents that are already disconnected from the economy may actually have less access to potential supports. And some of these residents live in communities that were already caught in a cycle of disinvestment, unable to promote economic development, invest in modern infrastructure, and really otherwise provide needed services to their residents. And many of these communities may actually be less resilient to shocks to the economy. And so we have to make sure moving forward that any investments that will be made to respond to the pandemic or to respond to an economic downturn in the form even of a stimulus are directed strategically to ensure that these communities don't experience further disproportionate impacts. And we're having a bit of a challenge here advancing slides, at least on my end. Oh, here we go. That was supposed to be the last slide, but I'm going to hand this off to my colleague, Craig Heather, who's a principal analyst here at CMAP, and he's going to tell us about some of the impacts to the transportation system.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, like she mentioned, I just want to kind of walk everybody through some of the COVID-19 impacts that we're seeing specifically on the transportation system. And let's start off with looking at the decline in traffic volumes. So volumes have definitely been declining over the last 2 months now. There we go. So what you're seeing on your screen is the decline in statewide traffic volumes. This is looking at the 4 Wednesdays in March of this year, and this is based off of IDOT's traffic count sensors. So if we look at the red line, which represents all vehicles, we see that for the first couple of weeks in March, there was no change. It was normal traffic. And by the time we get to the end of March, the volume has declined 40%. Now, what we're seeing, though, is that the impact is very different depending on the type of vehicle that you're looking at. So if you look at the blue line at the bottom part, that represents just passenger vehicles. And not surprisingly, that's seen the largest overall decline since the beginning of March of 46%. You can contrast that to the green line at the top, which represents combination trucks. These are the tractor trailers that are out on the road. Obviously, truck drivers have been classified as essential workers, and goods are still being shipped all over the country. And so that's really reflected in the fact that volumes for these vehicles have only declined 7% over the month of March. And then the final point of data on the chart is the gold line. Those are single unit trucks. These are smaller and medium-sized trucks, most typically used for pickups and deliveries within local markets. You can see their volume declined 23% over the month of March. So they're clearly being impacted by the closure of non-essential businesses. So let's take a quick look at how lower volumes are impacting our travel speeds. Okay, and again, what we're seeing here is for the 4 Wednesdays in March of this year. This is looking at the average system-wide speed on IDOT's interstate system. The vertical axis shows the average travel speed, and along the horizontal axis, we're showing time throughout the day in 30-minute segments. So if you look at the blue and the gold lines, again, those are for the first 2 weeks in March. They have a speed profile that you would expect from just a normal weekday, where there's a significant decline in travel speeds in the morning when a lot of people are commuting to work, and then again in the afternoon and early evening when people are heading back home from work and doing other errands. Well, if you look at the red line at the very top, again showing the last week in March, you can see that there is no noticeable decline in travel speeds throughout the day at all. So essentially the system is really operating in uncongested conditions. Now again, this is a system-wide average, so you still could experience localized slowdowns due to crashes or stalled vehicles or other incidents. But as a system, it's really operating fairly uncongested throughout the entire day. Illinois Tollway system has their own sensors, and they're really showing the same patterns. A decrease in volumes during the first couple weeks of the stay-at-home order of 55% for passenger vehicles, and truck traffic down 9%. And again, no noticeable decline in speed throughout the day. So the next thing I want to take a look at is how this is affecting safety on the roads. Okay, so this chart is showing us the number of serious injuries and fatalities that occurred pretty much in March. We took 1 month of data from the first week in March to the first week in April, and we looked at the cumulative total of serious and fatal injuries that occurred from traffic crashes. And then what we did is we looked at those same 1 month time periods from the last 2 years, just so we could do a direct comparison. I will note this crash data is only for the city of Chicago, but I think it does still provide a useful snapshot of what's going on in the region. So there's a couple of different sets of data in here. So let me break it down a little bit. Let's first of all focus on all serious injuries and fatalities. Those would be the 3 green shaded lines on the upper part of the graph. So the lighter green shades show data from 2018 and 2019, and the darker green shows the data from this year. So we can see that for the last 2 years, for about this 1 month period, there were a total of 200 serious or fatal injuries that occurred in the city of Chicago. For this year, that number was down to just above 150, so about 25% fewer than the last 2 years. The data at the bottom part of the graph, the blue shaded lines, those are serious and fatal injuries that occurred specifically to either bicyclists or to pedestrians. And again, we're seeing a pretty similar pattern. So the 2 lighter shaded lines are data for the last 2 years, where the range of injuries and fatalities was between 50 to 60. For this year, we're seeing the data has been lower. It's more around 45 or so. So certainly this is good news that we're seeing fewer serious and fatal injuries this year, and that's what we would certainly hope to see with less traffic on the road. One caveat with this, though, is that one of the concerns with having fewer vehicles on the road is the possibility that more drivers may tend to speed, and with increased speed, there's obviously an increased likelihood that a serious injury or fatality could occur from a crash. And in fact, we may be seeing a little bit of that. So while total serious and fatal injuries are lower so far this year, Northwestern University did do an analysis of the crashes, and they determined that the proportion of crashes that result in either a serious injury or fatality has actually gone up slightly this year. And they think that probably is due to people using higher speeds when they are driving. So we've talked about drivers. Let's take a look at what's been happening on our transit system. This slide probably comes as no surprise to anybody who's been watching the news. There's been an enormous impact on transit ridership. Specifically, our chart here is looking at ridership from April 6th of this year versus the same date last year. You can see system-wide ridership is down 83%. If we look at the individual service providers, for Metra, their ridership is down 97%, as downtown commuters are staying home and working remotely. For Pace Bus, their ridership's down 68%. And for the CTA, rail riders down 88%, and bus riders down a little bit less, only 76%. But you know, let's keep in mind, all the providers are still operating service to support the essential workers, and they're all following good social distancing guidelines, not only on the vehicles, but also in the stations to help protect the passengers and also the transit workers. I just want to make a note here that so the slides I've shown you so far, CMAP staff is working on updating all of these with more current data, and we will be posting updated impacts to our website on Friday. We've also been analyzing some cell phone data that's been made available to us through IDOT to really try and better understand more specifically how people's travel has changed during the pandemic. And so we'll also be releasing those results on our website on Friday. So because there has been such an enormous impact on transit, we wanted to just do a quick poll right now and get some feedback from the audience. So what is your top concern about the effect of COVID-19 on public transportation? Is it ridership numbers rebounding? Is it funding? Is it maintaining service and operations? Or is it something else? Please give us your answers and we'll see what the results look like. Okay, so funding, 54%. I agree that's always an ongoing concern, and especially given the COVID-19 impacts. Also, a fair number of people are concerned about ridership rebounding, and I think that's certainly something we're also interested in, and we're all going to be closely watching how things start to come back once we do get to a more normal state. Well, for my final slide, I just want to talk a little bit about what the potential impacts could be to motor fuel tax revenues. It's obvious that vehicle travel in 2020 is going to be less than what we were originally anticipating due to the stay-at-home order and also just the economic consequences of the pandemic. However, even with the decline in vehicle travel that we're currently seeing, it is likely that state motor fuel tax revenues for 2020 will still be higher than they were in 2019. And that's really due to the rate increase passed by the legislature. So this was a doubling of the tax from 19 cents per gallon up to 38 cents a gallon. In addition, state and county option rates are still set to increase on July 1st of this year. And that increase is going to be based on the rate of inflation as of March 2020. So it looks like as of right now, that rate increase would be about a half cent per gallon. Well, coming into 2020, let's focus on the actual table in front of you. So coming into 2020, we did a sort of a baseline forecast for what we were expecting the motor fuel tax revenue to be. Obviously, this does not include any COVID-19 impacts. So the 0 months under the baseline is really just indicating we were not anticipating any significant declines in VMT at all for the year. Under our baseline forecast, we were expecting statewide motor fuel tax revenues to be about $2.6 billion and about $1.3 billion of that coming to Northeastern Illinois. So that $1.3 billion includes funding that IDOT will use on projects in the region, as well as disbursements to local governments and to the RTA. Clearly, 2020 is not going to be business as usual, so we want to do a little exploratory analysis using the limited data that we have available to try and set some boundaries on what impacts to MFT revenue might look like. So scenario 1 that we're showing here is assuming that the significant declines in VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, that we're currently seeing are going to be phased out over a roughly 6-month period. So the result of that is that annual VMT for passenger vehicles would be about 12.5% lower than our baseline forecast. And for commercial vehicles, it's a smaller impact. It would only be about 1.5% lower than our baseline. So under this scenario, our estimate is that statewide motor fuel tax revenues would be still around $2.3 billion, with a little under $1.2 billion coming to Northeastern Illinois. So that's about a 9% decrease in our original baseline forecast for Northeastern Illinois. And then if we look at scenario 2, this is looking at things if the impacts go on a little bit longer. So under this, we're saying that the significant declines in VMT would get phased out over a 9-month period. In that case, we would expect passenger vehicle VMT to be about 27.5% lower overall than our baseline, and commercial vehicle VMT about 4% lower annually compared to our baseline. Under this scenario, we're still estimating about $2 billion in statewide motor fuel tax revenues and just under $1.1 billion coming to Northeastern Illinois. So that would be about a 20% reduction from our baseline figure for Northeastern Illinois. I also want to note that motor fuel tax revenue is only one source of funding for the state capital plan. So lower than anticipated revenues from this and other sources will undoubtedly impact or delay some projects. So I want to thank you, and I'm going to pass the baton now to my colleague, Jason Navoda, Director of Planning here at CMAP.
Well, good afternoon, everyone from the Chicago region and beyond. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Lindsay, for your presentations. I'd like to talk first about building on the transportation and revenue impacts of COVID-19 presented by Lindsay and Craig. And there we go. Okay. We're also interested in recent changes to air quality and emissions due to the change in transportation volumes. And we were inspired by some of the satellite images coming out of the NASA Earth Observatory program. And these maps that you see on your screen show the change in nitrogen dioxide emissions during the transportation and industry shutdown near the center of the COVID-19 outbreak in China. And these images remind us how connected economic activity, the movement of goods and people, pollution emissions from industry and transportation, air quality, and public health all are. And all of these things are goals of CMAP and our On2 2050 Comprehensive Regional Plan that was adopted in 2018. So more specifically, we were interested in whether the Chicago region experienced a similar change in emissions due to the transportation changes that Craig described. Just a bit of history here. In the United States, as this graph shows, our air quality has improved vastly since enactment of the Clean Air Act. approximately 70% less pollution than in 1970, and related illnesses and deaths have declined nationwide as well. The story is similar for the Chicago region. However, the Chicago region, like many other larger cities in the nation, does not consistently meet all national air quality standards. Nonetheless, air quality in the region has improved as well. Despite these improvements, however, air pollution continues to impact the health of people, including millions of deaths per year, asthma, lung cancer, headaches, and other health effects. And in fact, research shows that unhealthy air quality has a disproportionate impact on populations that already experience health issues. And it also appears now that these same people who are already impacted by respiratory health issues and other health issues are far more susceptible to serious COVID-19 impacts. But there's a big piece of this story that's missing. Not all pollution emissions cause acute health effects. Some of them are having much slower, longer-term effects on a global scale. And the effects aren't as apparent as a dry cough or a fever, but they are no less deadly, particularly for the world's most vulnerable populations. And now these graphs on your screen show US greenhouse gas emissions for a 28-year period from 1990 to 2018. On the left graph are emissions of the 4 most important greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And as you can see by the red band that makes up the majority of the graph here, by far the largest contribution is from carbon dioxide. Now the graph on the right, which unfortunately uses the same color palette, shows something different. That is emissions by sector. So the graph on the left is emissions by type of gas, and the graph on the right is emissions by sector of the economy. So each color here represents a volume of emissions from each major source. In the United States, transportation has surpassed electricity generation as the leading emitter of greenhouse gases, followed by electricity generation and emissions from industry. Now moving on to the Chicago region, these are some graphs from the Chicago Regional Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory that was produced in 2018 for the year 2015. And what this inventory found was that the total emissions in 2015 was 119 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was a 7% drop from the 128 million metric tons in 2010. Stationary energy and waste emissions both declined over this time period, while transportation emissions ticked up slightly. Let's unpack the transportation figures just a little bit more. So here we have broken down that transportation sector a little bit more. So if we look closer here, we find that on-road sources, which primarily consists of cars and trucks, are responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's followed by off-road sources, which are things like mining and construction, industrial and commercial equipment, and lawn and garden equipment. And while emissions from on-road sources remained relatively flat, as you can see in the graph on the right, off-road sources increased slightly, and this may be due to increased construction and other economic activity during the post-recession boom. It may have also included things like an increase in intermodal freight movements, which is the movement of freight from one mode of transportation to another, which is a big part of the freight movements in our region. So we wanted to sort of take a look at this in relation to the transportation volumes that Craig found from the Illinois Department of Transportation data sources. Now, what this slide shows are the modeled changes in emissions for a reduced travel day. That is, Craig and his team compared a typical travel day to a reduced travel day that's representative of the reduced travel during the quarantine. They fed the IDOT traffic volume data into the transportation model, and what you see in the table here were the outputs from that model. Now, I do want to mention that these are approximate and these are modeled figures. They are not based on actual collected data, and they represent only on-road sources. And that's going to be an important point when I get to my next slide. So as you can see, there were reductions in a variety of metrics: vehicle miles traveled, greenhouse gas equivalents, 35% reduction, 20% in nitrous oxides, 31% particulate matter, and 38% in daily volatile organic compounds. I do want to note also that the model does not account for increases in wildlife movements across the streets during our quarantine time. And let's try to get to the next slide here. Okay. So when we conducted the 2015 greenhouse gas emissions inventory, we also put together a number of projections from the year 2015 out to the year 2050. I want to note that these were done in 2018 and they do not account for any impacts of COVID-19. So first, I'd like you to just ignore the bright blue and the bright red lines on this graph and focus in on the climate scenario lines that are described in the colors on the left. Explains what each one of those are. So the first one is the business as usual scenario, which is indicated by the purple trend line leading to the upper right. And this assumes no change in emissions per capita or per person. And so this line mirrors projected population growth for the region and consistent emissions. The next line is the current trend scenario, indicated by the black line. And this assumes that future emissions decrease at a rate equal to the decline we saw between 2010 and 2015. And finally, the green line is the climate stabilization path. This assumes more aggressive decreases, more than doubling the rate of decline we saw between 2010 and 2015. And this is the trajectory we need to pursue to achieve climate stabilization, which is the level at which scientists believe will stabilize the climate with a global temperature increase of no more than 2 degrees centigrade. Now I'd like to explain the red and blue lines that are superimposed over this graph. While a 35% reduction in on-road greenhouse gas emissions is significant, this is only for on-road sources, that is cars and trucks. And as such, it only represents about a 16% reduction of the region's total emissions for all sectors. And that's what's shown here by the blue line. That would take us from about 119 million metric tons down to about 100 million metric tons if that reduction in greenhouse gas emissions were to continue. Now, if the region were able to attain a 35% reduction across all sectors, that would equate to the red line, which is approximately 78 million metric tons. So this snapshot suggests that even an ongoing pandemic and a flattened economy would not get us where we need to be in terms of emissions to get to that climate stabilization goal, nor are we suggesting that as a path forward. On the contrary, CMAP and On to 2050 have goals for a strong economy, less congestion, more equity across populations, and significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions by transforming our transportation and energy systems. We feel that these goals are not incompatible. In fact, we believe these are all essential to a strong, clean, and healthy region for all, and that we can achieve these goals. And as this EPA graphic shows, we can have economic growth, cleaner air, and fewer emissions. And really, there's no limit on how far these emissions can drop and how many lives may be saved. So as we come to the end of our presentation, we recognize that to achieve these goals, we will have to make difficult choices. We must reconsider the way we invest in the transportation system and the economy. We must ensure our transit system remains strong and improves to serve more of the region. We must find new industries to employ our workforce and train workers appropriately. The way out of the pandemic-induced recession could be the same path that leads us out of the climate crisis. A rare moment in time to take a major step in the direction of a clean and healthy future is here. And in closing, we have one more poll question for you. And this will identify how pessimistic or optimistic we are, those attending the webinar today. Can we reignite the regional economy and preserve gains in our air quality? Yes, no, or my favorite answer, it depends. Okay, closing the poll. A lot of people picked my favorite answer, it depends, but for those of the rest of you, we seem more optimistic than pessimistic, and I think that's a great sign. So thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions, and I'll turn it back over to my colleague, Jane Grover, to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to all the folks who chimed in with questions in this webinar. I'd like to start out with one for Lindsay. Lindsay, what can municipalities do to be more resilient to COVID-19's effects on municipal revenues? What strategies can they deploy, and how can they make up for the losses in those revenues? Be sure to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Jane, can you repeat the question real quick?
What strategies?
I missed part of it.
Sure. What strategies and what can municipalities do to be more resilient to COVID-19's effects, and how can they make up for losses in revenue?
That's a great question. Really, the million, or for some municipality, or for at least a couple local governments, multi-million-dollar question. I guess I would say that for many municipalities, it would have been great to have been able to get into a time machine and kind of get some cash reserves, so there'd be resources to handle some of the shocks that are happening right now. But given that that's not possible, I think moving forward, especially looking into being more resilient for future situations, either like this or other changes in economic conditions, it's important to really look at the revenue structure that a municipality has and see what sources of stability exist, see what sources of diversity might exist, and see where changes maybe can be implemented to make sure that there's some balance and make sure that there will be revenues, or at least to a certain extent, if there's future situations like this. And in the near term, I think we'll have to look for ways in which there might be continuing support through different federal and state initiatives, because this was a very unexpected situation. And I also think that some of the changes, some of the impacts to revenues were things that nobody would have expected. Nobody was expecting a pandemic. But here we are. Thanks for your question.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. I have a question, I think, for Craig, and the question is, a couple of questions have come in related to the New York City's response to handling public transportation in this era of COVID-19. The question is, do you have any information about what the Chicago Transit or other public transit agencies will do to handle safety measures once the stay-at-home orders are lifted. And do you have any information about whether the CTA will shut down operations for large portions of time as they did in New York City?
Also a great question. I do not have any specific information. Let me start with the CTA part. I don't have any specific information about that. I mean, you know, CTA has been running pretty much their normal service to try and support the essential workers that do need to use it. So that has been their primary concern, and I think moving forward, that probably will continue to be their primary concern. As far as New York, I'm not sure that the transit providers here are going to implement any changes to what they've been doing. You know, they've made service modifications, especially Metra and Pace, and they continue to do that as necessary. But they still want to be able to move people where they need to go. So thank you for the question.
Jane, are you still there?
Sorry, can you hear me? Thank you.
We can hear you now.
So did you miss the question? The question is whether, should money for new construction be diverted to operations to make up for the loss of operational revenue? And kind of related to that question is whether changes in transportation funding change what projects are considered regionally significant projects.
So this is Erin. I'll go ahead and take that question. I mean, I think that these are the ongoing conversations that we are having with our stakeholders across the region right now and trying to get to the bottom of. As we look at to the future with reduced revenues, we know that we are going to have to focus on more performance measures and performance-based decision-making tools to make sure that the limited resources we have go the farthest. But I think as we're talking about, you know, pots of money for operating and pots of money for capital, you know, at a time like this, you've seen the CARES Act provided funding from a capital bucket of funds to be able to be used on operations for transit agencies. So as we work with our Illinois delegation, our congressional delegation, we think it's critically important that we continue to reinforce the fact that municipalities, that local governments, and that transit operators need the greatest flexibility in order to be able to be responsive to the ongoing needs that are going on right now.
Thank you. And here's another question about the MFT revenues. The question is, has CMAP made any projections for the motor fuel tax revenues beyond 2020? Is it anticipated that revenues will return to normal, or will there be some lasting effect? If so, any idea of what that % reduction might look like?
I'll take this one. We have not looked into revising our projections for future years. Of course, as the MPO, we do make forecasts out 30 years for the motor fuel tax, but we have not revised the long-range forecast. I would say, though, that it really is going to depend on the length of the stay-at-home order, the trajectory of the pandemic itself, and then also what the economic downturn looks like. However, in thinking about the last recession, vehicle miles traveled was pretty stable during that time frame, and in fact, it's been pretty flat for the most part, at least for passenger vehicles. Since then, there's been some increases, but not large increases statewide, at least I'm speaking of. So this is something where it's really going to be unclear what the impacts will be until we get a better sense of what's going to happen in the world over the next few months and then into the next year. Thanks for your question, though. It's a really it's something that we're definitely thinking about here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Here's another question for you, Lindsay. Your projections about municipal revenue losses, when might you have those numbers? When might we know?
Sure. I'm looking forward to getting more data on that. It's a situation where, particularly thinking about things like sales tax collections, that takes some time between when people actually pay their sales taxes at a store, the store or whatever the business is remitting them to the state, and then those funds are then dispersed to local governments. And so we won't really have a sense of at least the initial impacts to local governments within the region on some of these issues for a few weeks, and then a few weeks from now, and then on the property tax, the impacts will take even longer to get a sense of. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. And we have time maybe for one more question before Aaron wraps up, and that is for Jason. Jason, what are some clean or green growth areas that we can focus on in the post-COVID-19 regional economy?
Yeah, it's a great question that's getting a lot of attention in a lot of different areas and fields, from climate professionals to economists to politicians. The one that's most interesting to me is the way that we invest in our transportation system and the way that we reinvest in our energy production system. So that is, we know that we need to make a major investment, major stimulus from the federal government and other levels of government to revive the economy. We also know that if we continue on the path we are going now, in other words, if we go back to business as usual, we will not be able to address the climate issues that we face. And so there's been a lot of talk about using this moment to rethink the way that we're investing in those systems, electrifying the transportation system, for example, by increasing the production of electric vehicles, providing rebates and other incentives for people to buy those, installing electric vehicle infrastructure throughout the region and throughout the nation so that people are not left without a place to charge. So that's on the transportation side. Of course, moving more people towards transit use is a good strategy. On the stationary energy side, we need to improve the energy efficiency in our buildings, both new and old. We have to retrofit the old buildings. Where does our energy come from? We need to move towards low carbon emitting sources, wind and solar and in fact nuclear, and move away from those sources that burn fossil fuels in order to generate the electrons that turn on our lights at night. So I think those are the two big ones that we need to really think about very seriously, and whether now is a time to make some major investments in those strategies. That's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason, Lindsay, and Craig. Now to Aaron. Thanks, Aaron.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, and we're sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but please feel free to reach out directly to our presenters with other questions that you have. We want to support you in every way that we can. So we know this pandemic is going to force all of us to work together like never before. And I think one of the other things that rings true is that, finding ways for CMAP to support local governments and looking at how service sharing might be an opportunity for the future to help stabilize municipal budgets and make them stronger. So the data and information that we have will continue to evolve. And we will continue to highlight regional developments related to COVID-19 and provide regular updates on our homepage, in our weekly update, and on our social channels. So I believe that we have an opportunity here to come back stronger, to redefine a 21st century transportation system, protect our natural resources and climate, and grow our economy for all. So we look forward to working with you on these initiatives and look forward to continue to share updated information with you and data that you need to be able to do your jobs. Thanks so much.